We're at an important moment. I think I used the word moment purposefully in American education. An unprecedented infusion of resources. We might not see this again. Certainly, I don't expect we will anytime soon. The stakes are really high. And yet I worry that we're as conflicted as ever about how to leverage this moment. And I also worry sometimes that the leaders in this community are talking past each other rather than with each other about what to do. So we're going to attempt to model what talking with each other might look like. Here's how it's going to work. Linda and Rick are each going to offer 8 minutes of prepared remarks. Each of them is going to have a 2-minute rebuttal to the 8 minutes that they heard each other provide, right? And then we're going to sit down and we're going to talk a little bit more about all of this. And I want you all to be thinking about what you've heard and how to take maximal advantage of both Linda and Rick. And at some point during the discussion, we're going to turn to the audience and take a few questions. I'll tell you now that as gracious a fella as I am, if I can't detect that a question is actually being asked, I might not be as gracious as I am known for being. All right. In the spirit of democracy, I am going to flip a coin to decide who goes first. Rick, heads or tails?
Heads.
All right. Pray I catch it. It's tails, Linda. So Rick goes first. All right.
All right, here we go. It's the first time I've ever done this by coin flip. I love it. I think, as Kent said, what you're not going to hear Linda and I do today so much is probably try to disprove what each other says. Rather, what you're going to hear is two fundamentally different ways of thinking about the challenges, rooted in the fact that I think we've come at these issues differently, we come from different backgrounds, and we think about them differently. What we're really going to do, I think, is offer you some distinctive and, in some cases, contradictory ways to think about the challenges. And it's up to you to figure out which parts of this resonate, what seems useful, and how do you apply it to your grant making. We were asked to talk about 3 elements in particular. First, how do I see, what's a vision of school improvement? First off, I want to suggest that I think for at least the last decade, we've had a fundamental problem in the way that we have talked about educational improvement. We've allowed it to be framed primarily in terms of closing achievement gaps. I think that's a problem. I think that's a problem because I don't think the historic role of democratic schooling is only to make sure that we are giving the worst off a chance. It's to make sure that we are cultivating the skills and capacities of every child in our society. I think not only is it conceptually flawed, I think there's 2 very practical problems that have flowed from our intense focus on achievement gaps. The first is a political problem. We have more or less been in the business in the school choice community, in the equity community, of telling 3/4 of America's families that this is not about them. That what we're talking about is something they should do because they should feel guilty. Because if they actually worry about the US GDP and employment picture 20 years downstream, that they should realize this is actually in their interest. It was Tocqueville a century and a half ago who pointed out that America tends to work on the basis of self-interest properly understood. And I think if we talk about educational improvement as something that 3/4 of the population should happily pay for because it's the right thing to do, I don't think that's politically workable, and I don't think it's a way to actually invest the American people. Second is a practical problem. What we've been talking about is fixing schools. We've been talking about improving teacher quality. What we've done is we've taken categories that were created a long time ago. The big box look of the American school, as folks from Linda to Dick Elmore have pointed out, has been with us since at least Horace Mann. And Horace Mann was just formalizing institutions that had been around for centuries. The notion of a box where we get an educator in front of a grouping of kids to tell them stuff was a perfectly reasonable solution given the tools and talent of the 1840s. It escapes me why we should assume that this is the default model for helping develop the skills and capacities of kids in the 21st century. Similarly, the teaching job we actually specifically engineered in the course of the 19th century. In 1810, 90% of American educators were men. We feminized the teaching profession in the course of the 19th century because it was cheap labor. We could get women cheap, they weren't allowed to do anything else, and we built a labor force and we built systems of pay and professional development around the notion of this captive labor force. Yet, rather than rethinking these job descriptions and rethinking what it means to deliver schooling, we figure out how do we take these 19th century anachronisms and cram more stuff into them. So, if that's the case, and again, you're free to accept or not accept this diagnosis. It's how I see the world. I'm not telling you it's how you have to see the world, but I think it's at least, we need to talk about this stuff more frankly than we often do. Second thing is, so what do we do about this? First thing we got to do about this is we got to stop using the word innovation. Linda and I actually agree on a fair number of things, this being one of them. Innovation is a bad word in education. My first book, my Harvard dissertation, Brookings published about 13 years ago, was called Spinning Wheels. I pointed out that the average large urban district in the mid-90s, when there was concern that we needed to shake them up, was launching 13 major reforms in a 3-year window. The problem is not that these were necessarily good or bad ideas. It's that if you've got any organization that's launching a major reform every 13 weeks, none of it's going to work, period. So the problem then, to my mind, is not necessarily can we come up with fanciful new solutions, it's can we devise organizations that can execute. And executing, again, practically speaking, is not just about trying to do these boxes better, it's about trying to solve problems. If you look at a low-performing school, it's actually a series of challenges. We're concerned about student engagement. We're concerned about teaching English language learners English language skills. We're concerned about the quality of our math instruction. We're concerned about the degree of parental involvement. These are specific problems that we can then start to address. The answer is not that we need good schools, or God forbid that we need turnarounds. The answer is we have specific problems, and we've got to be in the business of problem solving. This means that not only do I think that innovation is a bad word, but I think best practices is a bad word. I think data-driven decision-making ought to be banned. I think differentiated instruction obscures more than it reveals. Yes, I want teachers in a classroom to try to diagnose and assist kids based on where they are. Yes, I want us to use information to make smart choices. But using the jargon and the buzzwords gets us out of the habit of talking about what are the problems and how are we solving them. And it gets us into this notion that, oh Lord, look, we used to have a problem with low-performing schools. But now we got a new buzzword called school turnarounds. We got $3.5 billion in borrowed money that we're going to spend. We put the two together, it's like peanut butter and chocolate. We're going to have localities write grant applications. We're going to give them money. They're going to do the same stuff that didn't work under comprehensive school reform, but this time it'll come out better because we're going to call it school turnarounds. In fact, we've been trying to do school turnarounds for 40 years. Ron Edmonds spent a whole bunch of money, federal dollars, millions of them, on the effective schools research back in the early 70s. He was a bright guy. He identified the 7 characteristics of effective schools. We tried to do them in schools that weren't effective. They didn't take. The challenge is not always knowing what to do, it's being able to do it. If you don't believe me, go buy some shares of stock in TWA or Bethlehem Steel. It's not that they didn't know their models weren't working. It's that mustering the will and the organizational skill to do it's a different proposition. What does that mean? It means we need to rethink at least three key things. One, we need to rethink the tools that we use. The reason that Socrates developed the Socratic method was not necessarily because it's the optimal way to teach. It's because at that time and in that era, if students were more than about 25 feet away, you had to go, yo, Plato, listen to me. He was working with the tools that he had. If he was able to pipe biochemical expertise halfway around the world for free via Skype, he might have felt differently about the necessity of sitting face to face. Second, we need to think differently about the talent that we have. The teaching job was defined to fit a certain labor market. In the 1950s, 55% of college-educated women went into teaching. We had a monopoly on their labor, no sweat. Today, that's not the case. There are outfits like Citizen Schools, which says, wait a minute, we don't need necessarily to talk NASA scientists into becoming teachers. They want to teach. How do we start to rethink the teaching job so we plug them in? Third thing we need to do is rethink what we're doing in terms of expectations. A century ago, only 1 American in 10 finished high school. It wasn't necessary for employment. It wasn't necessary for life success to complete school. We believe the world is different today. Yet it took from 1647, when Massachusetts Bay Colony passed the first compulsory education law, until 1970, 3¼ centuries, for us to get 90% of American youth to show up in school on a given day. 13 years after we achieved that, the nation at risk declared that our schools were dramatically unprepared for the challenge at hand. Duh! We spent 3+ centuries building them to places where we could warehouse kids. If we want them to do something different, we need to rethink how and what we do about that. Philanthropy's role in all of this, real simple. We need to transform the space. We need to create opportunities for people to do differently. And this means philanthropy is 4 specific things it can do. 1, provide leverage. Provide leverage locally so people can do what it's hard to do, make decisions that it's hard to make. 2nd, provide the kind of political cover, decisions that can only be made when there's money on the table. Classic example is the way the $65 million helped create the possibility of a different contract in Washington, D.C. under Michelle Rhee. 3rd, provide transition support for folks who are developing and cultivating new models. I love KIPP and I love TFA. The leaders are dear friends of mine. These were ways to think differently about problems 20 years ago. They're not today. Today, these are part of the regular toolkit. We need smarter, better ways to solve these problems. And finally, we're heading into an era where we're not going to be able to keep raising per pupil expenditures year over year like we did from 1933 to 2008. We're heading into a different circumstance where we need to think very differently about cost effectiveness and bang for the buck, and philanthropy has a huge role to play there. Thank you so much.
All right. Rick, thank you. That probably was a little more than 8 minutes. So I'll make note of that, Linda.
Thank you.
Look at me, though, from time to time.
As I studiously avoid looking at Kent. So I want to start by reinforcing some things that Rick said, actually. This question about the fierce urgency of now, how can we achieve equity and quality, what do we need to do? Many reformers would, of course, answer this question by saying we need more innovation. And some would say further that we need to blow up the system, or at least parts of it, close failing schools, disempower school boards, crush unions, even get rid of the kids who cause us problems. Or bring our schools down, as zero-tolerance policies have done in many places, and some highly touted schools now do. In fact, we heard from our young performers earlier the notion that the teacher wants to get me off the roster. That's happening in a pretty extensive way. Schools in many places are pushing out large numbers of kids who do not achieve well, who bring problems with them to school. So, I think innovation, in fact, is something that, as it's been conceptualized,